Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. We are going to carry on in a moment with our discussion of the tools of the trade for today. We are going to finish up our discussion of evolutionary algorithms, and then we'll move on to and probably complete a discussion on physical simulation this morning. Okay. So before we dive back into that, any questions about the assignments? You're working on assignment 3, implementing sensors. We're going to be using 2 new libraries, matplotlib and numerical Python or NumPy. If you're not familiar with those 2 libraries, please make sure to get a good start on assignment 3 well before Monday. Any questions before we dive back to lecture? No? Okay. All right. So back to evolutionary algorithms. We introduced this idea last time that at least at its heart, evolutionary algorithms are somewhat intuitive. They're based on Darwinian evolution, where at all times we're maintaining a population of candidate solutions to our problem. The computer is deleting some members of that population according to a fitness function. The fitness function is something we give the evolutionary algorithm that tells it how to score candidate solutions or how to measure the relative quality of solutions. Poor solutions are deleted, and those that survive, we make randomly modified copies of them to replace the recently deleted solutions, and we can repeat this process until we achieve some threshold of quality, or we iterate this for a fixed number of iterations. Okay, evolutionary algorithms occurs when we combine robotics and an evolutionary algorithm, and now our problem is some behavior we would like a robot to perform, and a candidate solution to that problem is a robot itself. We introduced this idea of the fitness landscape last time. This is a mathematical construct that allows you to think about and reason about evolution in general. It was introduced by the evolutionary biologist Sewell Wright, but it's also very useful for thinking about evolutionary algorithms. We introduced the distinction between genotype and phenotype last time. Genotype is the blueprint or the recipe or the instructions of how to build something, and the phenotype is that thing. It's anatomy and behavior. In our case, the robot's behavior and the robot's anatomy. We looked at a hill climber last time, sort of arguably one of the most simple optimizers you can construct. Not technically an evolutionary algorithm because it has just a population of 1, this parent vector. It produces a randomly modified copy of itself called child. If child scores lower and sits lower in the fitness landscape, we delete the child and the parent produces another offspring. If the child has a higher fitness than the parent, we delete the parent, keep the child, rename the child to parent, and carry on. As we saw last time, the hill climber is very simple, but we pay for that simplicity with weakness. It's not a very strong learner. And the cartoon fitness landscape here tells you why. It's very easy for a hill climber to get stuck on a hill and never find the mountain or the part of the search space that contains the optimal solution or solutions. Simplest thing you can do, and you're going to be doing some of this in a couple weeks in the assignments. You can improve the hill climber by basically turning it into a parallel hill climber. So instead of creating 1 parent, we create n parent vectors, so n random vectors. At each pass through the evolutionary algorithm, each parent produces a randomly modified copy of self, the child. So we now have a population of 2n vectors. Evaluate the fitness of all the children. We go through each parent-child pair, one after the other, and perform basically a hill climber. The idea here, of course, is if we sprinkle enough initial points throughout the search space, and by search space, I mean the space of all possible solutions. In our case, this is going to be the space of all possible robots. We sprinkle a series of points in this surface. We hope that at least one of the parents lands on the slope of the mountain, the part of the search space that contains the optimal solution or solutions. But as you can see in this cartoon here, with just 2 parents, we got unlucky. We landed on 2 hills and we missed the mountain. Okay, so can we do better? Here's the next most complicated evolutionary algorithm, known as the genetic algorithm. This is sort of the most famous evolutionary algorithm. Sometimes the term genetic algorithm is used synonymously with evolutionary algorithms or evolutionary computation. The idea behind the genetic algorithm, how it differs from the parallel hill climber, is we introduce sex at this point. So up to this point, we've had one parent that you can think of this as budding off or splitting off and producing a child and introducing a mutation. This is a very common and sort of the first method of replicating oneself that was discovered in nature, asexual reproduction. Evolution discovered sexual recombination as sort of an extremely useful hack. And the reason why is somewhat intuitive. If we have two parents shown in blue, first parent is shown in red here, this is P1, and we have P2 in blue down here. You can see that P1 and P2 inhabit very different parts of the search space. I realize in the cartoon they're kind of sitting relatively low in the fitness landscape, meaning they're not very good at whatever it is we want them to do. Let's imagine that those two parents had already partly climbed their respective hills, so they were okay at whatever we wanted them to do. Let's further imagine that those two parents have different strategies to do okay at the task we want them to do. So you can think of this metaphorically as the parents have sort of figured out through evolution part of the solution. And it's possible that the two different parents have figured out different parts of the solution. If we cut both parents in half and take the left-hand red genetic material, the left side of the genotype of parent 1, and we copy it into child 1, we take the right-hand side of parent 2, we take all the genetic material from parent 2 on the right-hand side of this cut and copy it into child 1. We are combining genetic material from the two parents to create C1 in this case. We can do the same thing to produce a second child. In this case, we can do the opposite. We can take all of the genetic material to the right of the cut in parent 1 and put that into child 1. And we can take everything to the left of the cut from parent 2 and drop it into child 2. So like in nature, the children produced by sexual recombination by two or more parents receive different combinations of genetic material from the parents. In the cartoon here, we can see that C2 somehow inherited sort of more information from P1. C2 is closer to P1 and further from P2. And C2, because it's close to P1, is sort of trapped on the same hill. It's got sort of the same limitations that P1 does. But by chance, we combined some genetic material from P1 and P2 that placed C1 on the slope of a mountain. So again, metaphorically, you can think of this as the case of we have two parents that have solved different parts of the problem. And by cutting and recombining, if we recombine in the right way, we can combine the best of both worlds from both parents. And we now have C1 that is climbing the slope of the mountain. Toby asks, so these vectors act like chromosomes? That's exactly it. So you can think of these vectors as chromosomes or the genome. There's some data structure. When the data structure is a vector, like we're dealing with here, it's very much like a chromosome. We have a one-dimensional line along which we have a whole bunch of genes, and we are cutting and combining parts of chromosomes into one or more children. So pretty close to how sexual recombination works in nature. But like everything in biology, biology is infinitely more complicated. There are thousands and millions of genetic details that go into making sure that sexual recombination work well. I mentioned evolutionary algorithms is a whole field of study in itself. There's a whole course dedicated to this topic. There are dozens of versions of the genetic algorithm. There are different ways you can imagine performing asexual and sexual recombination. But you can hopefully this cartoon example gives you an idea about why we're building in biological detail to our evolutionary algorithm, which is we're hoping that, like in nature, combining genetic material or simulating certain evolutionary mechanisms will make it easier for the computer to evolve a solution to our given problem. Obviously, as we go, as you've seen in this progression from the hill climber to the parallel hill climber to the genetic algorithm, the evolutionary algorithm itself is becoming more complicated, but we are justifying that complexity by hoping or demonstrating that our evolutionary algorithm is becoming a more powerful learner or a more powerful optimizer. Many students who have taken this course in the past have actually explored this issue in their final project. So you can evolve your simulated robot or robots to do something, and you can swap in or create a more powerful evolutionary algorithm, and you can test for yourself whether that more powerful evolutionary algorithm actually allows you to evolve better or faster or more agile or more adaptive robots than a simpler evolutionary algorithm like the genetic algorithm or the parallel hill climber. All good? Okay. Let's look at one more evolutionary algorithm that works on vectors. Then we're going to look at an evolutionary algorithm that does not work on vectors. So the genome is not going to look like a chromosome anymore, but at the moment we're still looking at vectors. This one is called the evolution strategy, and it's well named because it's somewhat strategic in the way that the evolutionary strategy varies offspring. Remember, we have these 5 steps in an evolutionary algorithm. We're selecting the parents to reproduce, and we're also selecting which ones are deleted. Once we have chosen our parents, we can determine how they vary, how they produce offspring that are more or less like them. Okay, so let's see how this evolution, let's look at a problem first, and then we're going to see how the evolution strategy solves this. Let's look at a single chromosome or a single genome existing in the population. It sits at this point in the search space along the horizontal axis. You can see it's a pretty good solution. It's on the slope of the mountain. It's got relatively high fitness. I'm going to introduce this concept now of step size, and this is not to be confused with step size in PyBullet, which we'll talk about in a moment when we switch to talking about physics engines. The step here refers to mutation. How far are we going to step horizontally away from the parent? Remember that the horizontal axis represents different values of the genes, and each horizontal axis corresponds to each gene in the genome. In this cartoon example here, we're assuming we're only dealing with a vector that is 1 element long. It only has a single number in it. We're partway along, and obviously through mutation, when we produce an offspring, we can modify the values stored in the parent by more or less. We can step away further or shorter distance from the value of this gene in the parent. That's the step or step size. Imagine that when we copy the parent and we modify the value of the gene, we're going to modify it in a value between -1 and +1 of the parental value. So that's what's represented by the bars here. So the step size is set to 0.1. We are determining how big or small the mutation is. If you imagine this value of the parent and you imagine a child in which the value is greater than the parental value, up to 0.1 greater than the parent, all of these hypothetical children are going to be worse than the parent. Making this gene value larger makes things worse. Remember that we don't know this. This is why we're using an evolutionary algorithm. Assume that this whole mountain range is shrouded in fog. All we know is if we move horizontally to the right, in this case, we drop, we get worse. If we decrease the value of the parent gene in the child, if we mutate it to a lower number, things actually get better. So in this cartoon example here, we've got a 50-50 chance. If we choose a mutation in this range to the gene, half of the time those mutations will produce deleterious mutations, meaning they make things worse, deleterious mutation, meaning they make things worse for the offspring, and half the time it's an advantageous mutation. The offspring is more fit or better adapted to its environment than the parent is. So that's great, but again, we don't know that. Remember, the mountain range is shrouded in fog. Let's look at a different fitness landscape that is much more rugged. So what does a rugged fitness landscape mean? It means that for any individual, if it produces an offspring and we mutate that, there are large changes in fitness. Imagine we have this parent sitting here who has a value of gene 1 equal to whatever this is here, 0.25, let's say. It's actually doing very well. It's on the mountain and it's halfway to the top. This is an extremely fit parent. Imagine similarly that we're going to mutate children to have a value of more than 0.1 or less than 0.1, anywhere in this range. You can see, hopefully you can see that most of the children, the vast majority of them that fall into this region or this region, are going to have a fitness that is worse than the parent. It is only if we make a small decrease through mutation to the value of the parent, the value of the parent's gene, that things are actually going to get better. So a step size of 0.1 is good for this landscape, but for this landscape, 0.1 is not a good choice. How do we know what this step size should be? It's extremely difficult for us, if we're coding up an evolutionary algorithm, to know what this mutation step size should be. The evolution strategy is an ingenious algorithm that will determine what the step sizes are automatically. How is it going to determine the step size? It's going to evolve the step sizes themselves. So a chromosome or a genome in an evolution strategy is a vector of length n, where there are n genes specifying candidate solutions to the problem. But for each of the n vector, there is a paired n vector. So you can actually think of the chromosome here in evolution strategies as a 2 by n matrix, or two length n matrices. It doesn't really matter. The first vector encodes numbers that describe solutions to our problem, as usual. These could be synaptic weights of a neural network. And associated with each value in the other vector, this is the step size at which that gene should be mutated. So for example, if this parent survives, I don't know if I have a picture of this. No, I don't have a picture of this, so I'll just describe it. Imagine we have this parent here. We produce a copy of it. It survives to produce an offspring, and we start copying these values into the child genome. But this value undergoes mutation. So in the child, we're going to vary this value between 0.3 minus 0.1, so 0.2, or 0.3 plus 0.1 is 0.4. So the new value of this gene in the child is going to be anywhere between 0.2 and 0.4. We're varying that particular gene by an intermediate amount. If this gene gets mutated, it's mutated by a larger amount. And the final gene here is being mutated by a very small amount. We don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But when we're running the evolution strategy, not only these values can be mutated, but these values can be mutated as well. If you mutate the values in the second vector, what does that mean? What's the effect on that individual? If you have an idea, go ahead and type it into chat. If a mutation alters the step sizes in a genome, what's the effect? If we mutate these values, that mutates the synaptic weights, which alters how the robot behaves, how it reacts to its environment. Remember our Bratenberg vehicles. If we change the strength of connection between a photosensor and a wheel, that alters how the wheel is going to respond to different light levels. So mutations here will alter the behavior of the robot that's encoded by this solution. What's the impact of mutating the step sizes, the mutational step sizes associated with these values? Any ideas? Let's imagine we had a parent genome like this one, and all the step sizes were set to 0. What does that mean? If that parent produces an offspring, what can you tell me about that offspring relative to the parent? It would be exactly the same, right? No change, as Matt says, no change compared to the parent. Exactly. If these values are very high, the converse, you can imagine what will happen, is that the children will be very different from the parents. So imagine we start the evolution strategy like we start the genetic algorithm, which is to sprinkle points throughout the search space. They all have different values of the genes, and each gene has its own randomly set mutation size, which means for each parent in the search space, if it's producing children, those children may be more or less closer to the parent in the search space. In real problems, parts of the search space are smoother than others. So if you have some individuals that fall in a rough fitness landscape and they have large step sizes, they're jumping all over the place, like in this cartoon example here, and most of those offspring are going to be very low fitness, and that parent and its children or its offspring are not going to do very well. Alternatively, if there's another individual that falls in the same part of the search space that is rough, but that parent has relatively low step sizes, its children are going to be close genetically to it, and those individuals are going to move small distances horizontally, but assuming that the fitness landscape is rough, they're going to start climbing these very narrow, very steep mountains. I see that someone has their hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, just a quick question.
Sure.
Not to get too biological, but I guess the size of the step size is similar to like replication fidelity. So some organisms are like very good at having very similar replications, like in humans, but other times like viruses are not very good at having the same replication, so they have high mutation rates. Is it a similar idea?
That's a great point. So unfortunately for us at the moment, we have a great demonstration that having a high mutation rate can be a good strategy in the case of COVID. But obviously there are other situations where it's good to have high fidelity, as you just mentioned, like in humans and higher animals. For better or for worse, we're a pretty good solution for our ecological niche, at least we used to be. So producing offspring that are quite similar to us is a good strategy. So the evolution strategy acknowledges the fact that the size of mutation, or how well parents produce offspring, that fidelity itself is environmentally dependent. It depends on what your current environment is. Unlike the viruses and humans, which we just talked about, which have more or less fixed mutation rates, viruses and very small things have high mutation rates. Larger animals, larger organisms have low mutation rates or high reproduction fidelity. There are certain species that adapt the rate at which they mutate based on their environment. There is a set of, in plants, there's a set of proteins called heat shock proteins, and when a plant is stressed, if it is in an environment that is too hot or too cold, that temperature can trigger genetic changes which increase the mutation rate, which hopefully allows the plant, as it germinates and sends out seeds, that those plants are more different from the parental plant, and hopefully some of those seeds will be better able to find water or thrive in very hot environments, or they will be able to retain moisture in very arid environments, and so on. So if you're doing well, you're in a comfortable temperature, in the case of plants, You should have a low mutation rate. Whatever you're doing, it's working. But if you sense environmental stress, things aren't working, then it's a good strategy to adapt your mutation rate. And that's what happens in the evolution strategy. In the solution, which of the evolution strategy, or the strategy here, which is to evolve the mutation rates, there's the seed of another problem. What's the problem? We've solved one problem. We're not assuming what the step size should be. We're going to evolve the size of mutations. But that solution, in turn, raises another problem. What is it? Remember, when we're copying this parent data structure, we can mutate the genes or mutate the step sizes. We know how to mutate the genes because we refer to the step sizes. How do we know how much to mutate the step sizes by? A lot or a little? If you think about it, it would probably make sense to introduce a third vector which dictates how much to mutate the mutation magnitudes in this vector. But then how do we know how much to mutate the values stored in the third vector, and so on? So you can get into the problem of infinite regress here, which is if you're going to adapt how well or how poorly things make copies of themselves, you need to adapt how well or how poorly that process is evolved over time. Okay, that's beyond the scope of this course, just something to think about. Okay, we're going to talk about one last evolutionary algorithm and then switch to physics engines. And before we introduce this last evolutionary algorithm, I'm going to start with the problem, and then we'll talk about the solution. The problem is known as symbolic regression. Let's imagine that I give you some data that I've collected from the field. So this is not a fitness landscape anymore. Let's imagine that I take a whole bunch of observations at different X values. And when I take those measurements in the field, whatever that might mean, out in the world, I get back these corresponding Y values. I type my observations into a spreadsheet that has two columns, the values of X, the values of Y. If I plot that data, I get a scatter plot that looks like this. And even looking at this picture, hopefully you can see that this is not a random collection of points. There looks like there's a relationship here between X and Y. I'd like to know what that relationship is. I'd like to be able to write down a function of X, but I don't know what that function is. That's what the question mark stands for. That's the problem of symbolic regression. We're going to come up with a bunch of symbols. We need to come up with a bunch of symbols on the right-hand side here that regress or fit a line. So if I have an equation, if I have a bunch of symbols describing y as a function of x, then I could draw that as a line rather than a scatter plot. And I could try and regress that line so that it is as close to these points as possible. Some of you in your statistics class might have heard of linear regression, which is the simpler case of fitting a straight line to some data. But you can see in this cartoon example here, there is no straight line that will do so. We need to do something else. We're going to try and do symbolic regression. For the mathematically inclined out there, what is it? Does anybody, you can sort of, if you're comfortable with math, you can do a little bit of symbolic regression in your head. Alex suggests y equals x squared plus 3. Remember back to your high school algebra? Okay. So if I guess y equals x, which is not a good guess, I would get this line, y equals x, and we can ask how closely is that line regressed or close to the data. The thin lines here are meant to represent the error. Clearly this is not a good match. The straight line is representing a prediction. The straight line, or the model, says that if the value of x is 1, then the value of y should be 1, but the value of y is definitely not 1. It's something much larger. So this is a very poor guess. It has high error. So we're going to create a fitness function in a moment. that is a fitness function that would give this solution low fitness. So we're already switching now from talking about symbolic regression to an evolutionary algorithm. In the evolutionary algorithm, solutions to the problem are going to be equations, and the problem is symbolic regression. We want to try and fit a curve to this data. So Alex was close. X minus 3 squared, I think, is a little closer. Although I've written it in red. Usually when I write something in red, that means I made a mistake. So I'll leave it up to the reader, the listener here, to figure out whether Alex is right or I'm right. You get the basic idea. There are some equations that are closer to these points than others. Okay. So that's symbolic regression. This is a very real problem and a very useful thing to do if you can solve it. Here's a local example. For those of you that ever have spent summers in Burlington, you know, unfortunately, that at certain times through the summer, some of the various bays in Lake Champlain become infested with toxic algal blooms. They can be very bad news for pets and anyone swimming in the lake at that time. So a good question is, what is causing these blooms? They appear at different parts in the lake at different times in the summer. Some summers are worse than others. It's very hard to predict where these blooms are going to occur. And obviously, if we could, that would be a good thing to know. We know some things. We know that nitrogen and phosphorus in fertilizers that are put on fields in the spring, and then spring rains run off nitrogen and phosphorus into the lake. Algae love nitrogen and phosphorus, so that is definitely a big part of the problem, but it is not the only problem. So let's imagine we do some field work, and there are UVM scientists who do exactly this every summer. Create a big spreadsheet, and at different points in the lake, at different points in time, we can measure the amount of nitrogen at that place, at that time, the amount of phosphorus, the temperature of the water. Generally speaking, the warmer the water is, the more likely an algae bloom to occur. Turbidity, how opaque is the water? Is it see-through, or can we not see very well? How much rainfall was there today? How much yesterday? How much a week ago? And then finally, we measure Y, which we're going to call T here. This is the thing that we're trying to predict, the amount of toxic algae per milliliter, which we'll just represent as T. We would like to construct a function that uses some or all of these variables if they're useful, and that equation should produce a curve that predicts or matches our observations about toxic algae in the lake. It turns out that T equals N is actually pretty good. The more nitrogen in the water, the more likely there is to be an algae bloom. But the ratio between nitrogen and phosphorus plus the amount of nitrogen is even more predictive. So T equals N plus P over N, the amount of nitrogen plus the ratio between nitrogen and phosphorus, is an even better model that predicts T. Already, N plus P over N is hard to know exactly what it is. There's something about combinations of nitrogen and phosphorus that the algae really seem to love. So maybe it's not just a matter of trying to convince the farmers to decrease the amount of nitrogen. If the ratio between nitrogen and phosphorus influences toxic algae, perhaps we can create an alternative fertilizer that still has nitrogen and phosphorus in it, but has a different ratio that's good for the farmer's field, but not so good for the algae. Right? So we're dealing with a very abstract problem here, symbolic regression, but we could see that if we solve this problem, it might eventually start to lead to policy that could be socially useful. Okay, that's the problem. Let's turn to the solution. We're going to look at this last evolutionary algorithm called genetic programming. I'll talk about the name in a moment, but let's talk about the algorithm itself first. Here are two parents, P1 and P2, and as you can see, the genome no longer looks like a chromosome. It is no longer a vector. It is a tree data structure. Some of you may have seen tree data structures before. Some of you may not have. So here's a cartoon to show you how this a tree is represented. It looks very much like a graph. We have a series of nodes and edges or arrows connecting them. A tree has one node which acts as the root, and each node has one or more children, which are pointed to by the arrows. This is also not unlike how robots are represented in URDF files, where the robot has a root link, the main part of its body, and then there are pieces connected to it, like our bones are connected together into our skeleton. You can represent a human skeleton more or less as a tree. You can represent a robot as a tree. You can also represent an equation as a tree. You do that by taking the nodes, these nodes, and you represent. These are non-terminal nodes. I guess I should introduce some terminology here. In the case of P1, there are two non-terminal nodes, this one, and there are three terminal nodes. And you can obviously see what makes a terminal node is it's a terminus. It has no children. All non-terminal nodes have operations in them: multiplication, plus, sine, cos, multiplication, division, power, anything you want. You can choose which algebraic operators you want. They go in the non-terminal nodes. And we're going to place variables and constants in the terminal nodes. Okay. So how do we construct these genomes to begin with? Remember, in the first step of an evolutionary algorithm, we need to create a population of random solutions. So in genetic programming, we need to create a population of random trees. So let's take P1. How did we construct P1? Well, we started by defining the operations that we're going to use to build our equations. And in this case, we're going to just choose algebraic, plus, minus, mult, divide, and trigonometric functions, sine, cosine, and maybe we'll throw power in there as well. So power is going to raise a to the b. Okay, so we got a whole bunch of operators. We throw them in a bag. We have a bunch of variables like N, P, W, B, R. These are sort of the building blocks of our equation. And then we throw in some floating point values as well, some constants that could also be useful. We put all these operators, all these variables, all these constants into a bag. We shake up the bag, and we're going to construct P1 by reaching into the bag. And by chance, we pull out multiplication. So we put multiplication at the root node. We only have one node at the moment. Multiplication requires two arguments, A and B. So we construct two empty nodes. We're going to have something times something. We go to the first empty node and we reach back into the bag. We're going to do selection with replacement. Replacement meaning that we just chose multiplication. So we put multiplication back in the bag. We replace it. So we have everything back in the bag. We shake it up again, reach in, and at random, we choose something from among this set. In this case, we selected plus. Plus also has two arguments, A and B. So under plus, we create two empty nodes. We go to the first empty node, reach into the bag again. In this case, we pull out a random floating point value, 0.8. 0.8, the number has no arguments, so we're done. This becomes a terminal node. This is filled in. We still have an empty node here. We still have an empty node here. So we go to this empty node, reach in the bag again. In this case, we happen to pull out x. X is a variable. It has no arguments. So we're done. We have one last empty node. We reach into the bag, and in this case, we pulled out 1.4. So we have 0.8 plus x times 1.4. So if you look at this tree, you'll notice that it encodes an equation. How do we write down the equation that corresponds to this tree? We do depth first, traversal. Again, for those that aren't familiar with trees, depth first traversal means we're going to traverse the tree. We're going to visit each node, and we're going to do it depth first. We're going to go to the top of the tree, We're going to go down first. So we go down to the first child. This child has two children of its own, so we go to its first child, and we can no longer go any deeper. So we take 0.8, we now go back to where we were before, plus 0.8 plus, we now go down again, x, so 0.8x, we're done traversing this part of the tree. We come back up, and we write multiplication. So we now have 0.8 plus x times, and we go back down 1.4. Okay. The details of this, if you're not comfortable with trees and depth first traversal, aren't so important, but I think you get the basic idea. We're constructing an initial population of equations. The way that we're encoding those equations as trees. Here's P2. As you can see, we constructed P2 by, again, repeatedly reaching into the bag of operations and operands, pulling things out. In this case, we've built a tree that has a different number of nodes. Actually has the same number of nodes, but it's got different connectivity. This encodes a different equation. What is this equation? If you have an idea, go ahead and type it into chat. That's it. Logan's got it, right? So we're doing depth first, which means we go here, we go down to the first child, 0.2, 0.2 divided by x plus y. Exactly. Okay. So here's our two equations encoded by our two parents. For each of these equations, you can imagine that the equation draws a curve. The fitness of that curve is how close that curve gets to all the points. The lower the error, the higher the fitness. Okay. In this example here, we're going to assume that these two equations had relatively high fitness. They both survived the selection process. Some of the other equations in the population were deleted. These two equations are going to be sexually recombined. We're going to combine genetic material from these two parents to produce two new equations, C1 and C2. How do we do sexual recombination with equations? Well, we take the trees and we pick 2 points in each tree. This is going to be the cut point where we're going to combine genetic material. So that's why I've colored this node red in P1. That's the point where we're going to combine things. And I've chosen the plus node in P2, which is the other place where we're going to make a change. You'll notice that in P1 and P2, we now have a red subtree. That red subtree has just one node, 1.4. P2 has a blue subtree, which contains 3 nodes, x plus y. We unplug those from P1 and P2. So we're now holding the two subtrees, and we swap them. We're going to take x plus y, we've unplugged it, and we're going to attach it to C1 down here. C1 inherits the black genetic material from P1, but it's going to inherit genetic material from its other parent down here. So here's the blue sitting over here, and C2 has inherited the black genetic material from P1 and the red genetic material from P1. So if you stare at these two pictures, you'll notice that C1 and C2 combine genetic material or inherit genetic material from both parents. And I've written the new equations for you at the bottom. You can see that both equations resemble the original two equations, but now they're slightly different. You can compute the fitness or the error of these two new equations. They're going to produce different curves. And the curve C1 and the curve C2, one or both of them may be a better fit. They may be closer to the points than the parents. Those children would probably outcompete the original parent equations, and around we go. If you use genetic programming, which is the evolutionary algorithm, you use it to try and solve symbolic regression, you can actually see over evolutionary time that these curves are sort of bending and fitting closer and closer to the points. Okay. Okay. Any questions about that before we move on? Okay, we'll end our discussion on evolutionary computation with sort of a fun example. I just showed you genetic programming, which encodes equations in trees. Genetic programming always evolves trees, but the trees can encode different things depending on what your problem is. In the case when we're trying to solve symbolic regression, the trees encode equations. In the Mona Lisa example I'm showing you here, the trees encode pictures. So let's imagine that we take the actual picture of Mona Lisa, or a JPEG of the actual picture of Mona Lisa. In that JPEG, we have, I don't know how many pixels, let's say 200 by 200 pixels. So we have 200 by 200, 40,000 pixels. Each pixel has 3 numbers associated with it, red, green, and blue. So if we have a 200 by 200 pixel image of Mona Lisa, we have 200 times 200 is 40,000 times RGB is 70,000 numbers in total. We want to evolve a tree, and that tree is going to encode a representation of the picture of Mona Lisa. You can see some of these evolved pictures here, but that tree is going to encode much less than 70,000 numbers. In essence, we're using genetic programming here as image compression. It's going to approximate an actual image, and we're going to evolve that solution, that approximate image, so that it looks as much like the original image as possible. So here's a snapshot at the beginning. Here's one of the initial random trees. I haven't told you yet how it's encoding these images. Here's an initial random tree. This is the image it produces. At the next generation, the best survivor produced this picture. At this third generation, the best survivor produced this picture, this picture, this picture. And at the end, actually, I can't even tell by looking at this whether the final image here is the actual bitmap or whether this is an evolved solution. If we let this evolutionary algorithm run long enough, it'll often produce a picture that's indistinguishable from the original image. So I'm going to just run this. I'm going to run the YouTube version of this. You can see the number of generations increasing, and at each frame in this video, you're seeing the tree in the population that has the highest fitness. Okay, so while you're watching this, can you figure out, or can you make a guess about how the trees in the population of trees, how a tree is encoding a solution to the problem? What is the tree representing? If it's not immediately obvious to you how the tree is encoding these approximate images, what are the building blocks here? What is the genetic programming algorithm making use of? Any ideas? So as Henry mentions, you can see there's a bunch of triangles here. So how might you construct a tree to encode a number of, it's layering a bunch of triangles. Yep, so obviously there's many. AI Batcher says shapes and hues, right? So it's actually not triangles. It looks like triangles. There's a whole bunch of polygons. So each tree encodes a number of polygons. It's kind of easier to see when we restart the image. Each polygon has its own color, its own hue, its own set of RGB values. There's something for each shape. There's the shape itself. What's the shape of the polygon, the hue? An addition of vector spaces. So there's actually different ways you could do this. You could re-encode this as a set of vector spaces. That's right. How does the tree encode a polygon? Or how does the tree encode a series of polygons? How might you do this? If you were to sit down and write this up, how would you get the tree to encode an arbitrary number of arbitrarily shaped polygons? If you think about a subtree in a tree, that subtree can have an arbitrary number of nodes. Maybe each of those nodes indicates a vertex for that polygon. So each subtree encodes a polygon. By adding or decreasing the size of the subtree, you're adding or removing vertices from the polygon. You might have some additional numbers encoded along with the subtree, which is the color. You'll notice also transparency here, so you can see through some of the polygons to the polygons underneath. You could have mutation operators that add and remove whole subtrees, which adds and removes polygons. You'll notice in the video that it starts with a few polygons and starts to add some. Lots of different ways you could solve this problem. I like this example again just because it gives you a visual understanding of sort of how evolutionary algorithms work, and in this case, specifically how genetic programming works. Okay, any questions about genetic programming or evolutionary algorithms before we move on to I guess we'll be starting today our discussion on physical simulation. All good? Okay. All right, so we're moving on to our third and final sort of set of tools that you'll be using in this course. Obviously, you're already partly familiar with a physics engine. You're already using one. Physics engines differ. They're very different from computer graphics. Obviously, the field of computer graphics and video games started with traditional 3D graphics, where we want to construct a virtual scene in three-dimensional space. In order to do so, we need to define a set of objects. Computer graphics, we set the position and orientation and shape of each object at time t. We render that 3D scene. We then tell the computer how to alter the positions and orientations and shapes of each object at the next time step, render, repeat this process indefinitely. If you do this cleverly, you can create an animation of an object accelerating towards the ground and then coming to rest at the ground. As you can imagine, in computer graphics, it's an exceedingly painstaking process to determine manually what the new position and orientation of objects should be. So around the year 2000, that was sort of the first physics engine came out. It was known at that time as Math Engine. In the UK, it was the first company that commercially produced a physics engine. Physics engine differs from computer graphics in the following way. We also define positions and orientations and shapes of our objects, but we also have to assign them physical properties like mass and friction. We can add joints, which indicate how the objects are attached together. And remember that joints indirectly tell the physics engine how the relative motion and orientation of objects is constrained. We then press go, and the physics engine creates the animation for us. At the very lowest level of a physics engine, we have Newton's second law, which is force equals ma. If you rearrange this into A equals F over m, you get a sense of how physics engines work. Remember, at each time step, the physics engine knows the mass of objects. It knows which objects are attached together. Given all that information, the physics engine can compute all of the forces that are acting on an individual object. So one force for sure, if the object is off the ground, or actually if the object is on the ground, there's one force that's continuously pulling on that object, which is gravity. If we have two objects connected by a joint, and there are some forces that are trying to pull the objects apart, The joint will apply additional forces to both objects that are pushing them back together, because we added a joint saying that those objects cannot move apart from one another. If an object comes into contact with the ground applies a force pushing the object up so that the object does not sink through the floor. So at every point in time, a physics engine computes all the forces acting on every object. And depending on what's happening in the virtual world at that time, there may be more or less or different forces acting on these objects. It integrates or combines all of those forces, divides those forces by the mass of the object, which gives it back the acceleration of that object. From the acceleration, we can take the derivative of the derivative, we integrate the integration, which will give us the change in position. Acceleration is change in velocity. Velocity is change in position. So it's only 2 hops from acceleration to new position. The physics engine uses that to compute the new positions of the objects and also their orientations at the next time step. So this is why physics engines were introduced, was to try and alleviate this painstaking process that animators were performing in computer graphics. I mentioned that the first physics engine was introduced in 2000 in the UK. I was a master's student working at the University of Sussex in the UK at that time. We had a representative from this company come to our university and suggest maybe physics engines could be useful for robotics. Maybe it would be useful for us as roboticists to simulate our robots in this new thing called a physics engine first, before trying to build those robots as reality. And in the last 21 years, that's become the standard way to do this. Okay, so physics engine and robotics were sort of friends from the beginning. Okay, so in this lecture, we're gonna look at various aspects of physics engines, and I've pulled out some code, and this is code that is from a different physics engine known as Open Dynamics Engine. We used to use ODE in this course. That's why some of the code snippets are from ODE, but I think it's useful for you to just see code from a different physics engine. There's different flavors of physics engines. They're all more or less the same. This code is also C++ rather than Python. You do not need to memorize this code or know exactly how it works. I'm just going to use this code to illustrate some of the building blocks of physics engines. Okay, so when you run PyBullet, remember that PyBullet calls bullet underneath, which is running in C++. Bullet has code that's kind of like ODE. It initializes the physics engine itself and creates a world, as it's already seen. In the case of Open Dynamics Engine, it creates what's known as a hash space. We're not going to talk too much about hash spaces in this class, but this space is going to contain a subset of the objects that you have defined, and these are objects that cannot interpenetrate. These are objects that the physics engine has to pay particular attention to, because if they interpenetrate, like for example, if a sphere sinks into the ground, the floor is an object, the sphere is an object, that should not happen. And we're going to see how physics engines deal with that in a moment. If some of these objects do interpenetrate, the physics engine is going to create a contact group. This is a group of all the objects that are in contact with one another. And again, the physics engine is going to apply some forces to fix these problems. Any objects that are floating in space or not touching any other objects are outside this contact group. As you've already done in your code, you can set various details of how your world works. You can set gravity to Earth normal, which is minus 9.8 meters per second. You can set this to Mars gravity. I'm glad that we talked about gravity today, because I forgot to remind you at the beginning of today's class, there is something very important that's going to happen on the surface of Mars around 4 o'clock this afternoon. What is it? What's happening on Mars today? The new rover is scheduled to arrive at 4 o'clock. If you're in class, if you're not in class, be sure to tune in to NASA TV or YouTube and we'll see whether Perseverance makes it to the surface of the red planet. Perseverance itself is an interesting robot. Maybe we'll talk about it next week. Perseverance, if it lands, if everything goes well, I think later this week or next week, Perseverance is going to release a drone from its belly. And this drone, again, if the drone works, will be the first time the human species has flown something in the atmosphere of another planet. Should be pretty exciting. Okay. 4 o'clock this afternoon. I don't know how much that time is going to differ based on what's happening at NASA, so just keep an eye on that. Okay, back to physics engines. So we can set the gravity to be Earth normal, Mars normal, Moon normal, no gravity. You can simulate space robotics using a physics engine. There are other parameters you can set that have that sort of that tune the virtual world to match some physical world in which your robot is going to operate. We won't go into the details of that today. Okay. We're going to now talk about bodies. These are known as bodies or objects. In PyBullet, they're known as links. They have different names, but obviously these are the physical structures that make up your world. And as I've just mentioned, when we create an object, we need to set its position, which you do in your code. You can set the orientation of the object. We haven't got to that yet in the assignments, but we will. In case of a sphere, the orientation obviously doesn't matter, but if we create a block or rectangular object, we can set the orientation of that object. We can set the mass, which is set here to 1 by 1 by 1, which seems odd. You imagine mass to be a single number. You can actually specify how mass is distributed throughout an object. So in my smartphone, more or less, the mass is the same at every point inside this object. In my half-full glass of water here, there's more mass in this part of the object than there is in this part of the object. So you can distribute mass throughout an object. It's probably beyond what we're going to do in this course. So we're setting the mass, position, orientation, and yeah, okay, so that's objects. When we specify the orientation, this can be a tricky thing to do in 3 dimensions because strictly speaking, we need 4 numbers. We need to take our object. We need to indicate how it's rotated about 3 axes and then how much it's rotated about that 3-dimensional axis. Those 4 numbers are usually encoded in what's known as a quaternion. Unless you're mathematically inclined, it's exceedingly difficult to manipulate, to think about quaternions. So later in the course, when you're setting the orientation of your objects, we're going to use just 3 numbers. Those 3 numbers are going to represent an axis, a vector in 3-dimensional space. And we're going to assume that if you give the physics engine those 3 numbers as orientation for the object, you want that object to be aligned along that vector. If we're dealing with a cylinder, that's sufficient because if you imagine a cylinder that's rotating about its long axis on that vector, it's still the same object, right? It looks exactly the same. But if we have an object that has different length, width, and height, like my cell phone, then obviously it is going to look different in the physics engine depending on its orientation about this vector. So we're going to use, we'll use cylinders when we start to get into 3-dimensional, setting the 3-dimensional orientation of the object. Gets a little tricky, but we can sort of simplify things by just manipulating 3 numbers. We want our object to be aligned along this vector. Okay, joints, we've already talked about this quite a bit. So there are different kinds of joints. We're going to be dealing with what are known as Revolut or Hinge joints. And Revolut, as the name implies, is going to allow the 2 objects connected by the joint to revolve or rotate relative to one another. We can also create linear joints in which the 2 objects can change their position relative to one another, but not their orientation. We can create pistons. For now, we're mostly going to be dealing with hinge joints. Once we create a hinge joint, we have to tell the physics engine which 2 bodies, or in our case, which 2 links are connected. which two links are that hinge joint is going to connect. We need to give a position in three-dimensional space. Where's the fulcrum of the point? Where does the joint exist? And finally, which you haven't done yet, we're going to have to define the axis of the joint. What is the axis? The axis is going to indicate in what plane, in what two-dimensional plane, the two objects are going to rotate relative to one another. So let's imagine my upper arm is object 1 and my lower arm is object 2. And I want these two objects to rotate relative to one another in the horizontal plane. If these two objects are themselves attached to another object like my torso, obviously they might also start to move, but in those two objects' coordinate frame, they're always moving horizontal to one another. Not horizontally in the world as a whole, but relative to one another, it's always horizontal. We tell the physics engine that by defining a normal vector, shown in the cartoon example here is the axis. And in this case, it's 0, 1, 0. In ODE, the vertical axis is the second one, not the third one. So I'm defining a normal vector that points upward. And you can see obviously an upward pointing vector. The plane that is normal to that vector is the horizontal plane. So if I define an object like this, another object like this, I attach a joint with a fulcrum at this point, and I give it a joint normal or a joint axis that's vertical, they'll move like this. If I take the same two objects and I assign a normal that's pointing into the screen, so whatever that would be, 0, 0, 1, the same two objects are going to rotate through the vertical plane relative to one another. And as they start moving, of course, they're not going to stay vertical, but I'm saying which plane I want those two objects to rotate relative to one another. So the joint axis is defining the plane through which they're going to move relative to one another. Okay, we'll get to that a little bit later when you start to build more complex robots with joints that are connected and allow pairs of objects to rotate in different angles. Okay, let's talk about contact detection and resolution. So what happens when objects come in contact with one another? In both ODE and Bullet, they wrap a skin around each object. That skin in ODE is known as a geom, and in PyBullet, that skin is hidden from you completely. If we go back a moment, you'll notice when we define the body, we define the position of the body, or the initial position of the body. We define the mass distribution, but we didn't say anything about the shape or the size. So you can think of this as sort of this thing floating in space that has no skin, it has no outer surface. The minute you give that thing a shape and a size, so when you're creating blocks in PyBullet, when you give a length, width, and height, that is stored in a separate data structure from the position and the mass of the object. There's a technical reason why they're stored differently, but for our purposes, you can think about objects as having mass, position, and then a skin wrapped around them. What the physics engine is doing, obviously, is using that skin to deal with collision detection. When are these objects in contact? And if they do contact, the physics engine is going to determine forces that should be pushing on the objects to separate them again. Let's have a look at one cartoon example here. So in this cartoon example, let's imagine we have 9 spheres bouncing around in our virtual world. There's no joints connecting these spheres together. They're independent at the moment. But if any of these spheres happen to come in contact with one another, we do not want them to interpenetrate. We're going to assume that these are steel ball bearings. They're not balloons. They're not going to deform, or they're not going to pass through one another. They can't pass through one another. So in order to determine if any pair of objects is in contact with one another, how many collision detection events do we have to consider at each time step? We don't want any of these objects to interpenetrate with one another. How many tests do we need to perform if we have 9 independent spheres bouncing around in our virtual world? We're just at the moment trying to determine whether any objects are in contact with any other at the moment. Let's not even consider the ground plane at the moment, which would maybe be our 10th object. We're obviously we have to look at object pairs, right? So we need to take each object, and for each object, we need to consider each of the other 8 objects and ask the question, is any of those 8 objects in contact with the current object? So as Lucas mentions, if we take one object and we look at the other 8, there's actually 8, not 9, that we need to consider. Oh, 9 exclamation point. Is that correct? Let's see. So we need to consider 1 and then the other 8. We then need to go to the second sphere. And when we go to the second sphere, how many tests do we need to do? We just did 8 tests when we visited the first of the 9 objects. We asked, is object 1 in contact with object 2? Is object 1 in contact with object 3? And so on. When we go to 2, we need to ask, when we go to the second object, we don't have to ask if object 2 is in contact with object 1 because it's symmetric. If objects 1 and 2 are in contact, then object 2 and 1 are in contact. So when we visit the second object, we need to consider the other 7 objects. We need to consider 8 plus 7 plus 6 plus 5. So not 9 exclamation point, Lucas, but you were close. So if we have n objects, for each of those n objects, we need to do at most n minus 2, n minus 1 divided by 2. We can get away with a little bit less than that. But generally speaking, we need to consider each object and whether it's in collision with every other object. But since it's symmetric, we only have to do half those calculations. You'll notice here that in this equation, there's an n times n here. So as the number of objects in our virtual world increases, at every time step we have to do on the order of n squared collision detection tests. That's a pretty expensive calculation. In this case, we have n equals 9, so we have 9 times 8 is 72. 72 divided by 2 is, we have to do 36 tests in this case. So obviously this is pretty expensive. We haven't even got to the point of what do we do if there is a collision detection. There is a huge branch of computational geometry dedicated to trying to get these collision detection events to be less expensive computationally. One way to do this is to perform a hierarchical calculation where at every point in time the physics engine looks to see if there are bunches of objects. Are there subsets of objects that are close together? Like maybe at this point in time, 4 of the 9 are relatively close to one another. The other 5 are also relatively close to one another, but these 2 groups are sort of spread out a little bit. The physics engine can place a bounding box. So imagine we put a cube and the size of that cube perfectly contains these 4 objects and the second cube perfectly contains these 5 objects. We can then ask if these 2 boxes are in collision with one another. If these 2 boxes are not colliding with one another, like in the example here, then we don't need to consider whether any of the objects in this box are in contact with any of the objects in the other box. We know by definition they're not. So we can get away with fewer than 36 detection events. We can ask whether any of the objects in here are in collision with one another, and we can then ask, are any of the objects in here in collision with one another? I'll leave that as an exercise for you to think about how many in total collision detection events we need to do if we, in this case where we have 2 bounding boxes. We're out of time for today, so we will stop here. You have a quiz due tonight at 11:59 p.m. You're working on assignment 3, and be sure to tune in and watch Perseverance land on the red planet around 4 o'clock this afternoon. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye-bye. You're welcome.